Hey guys, tonight we're dragging you out of your bedroll and straight into the dust-choked sunrise of the American frontier, where breakfast isn't just the most important meal of the day, it's the most likely to kill you. If you're enjoying these deliciously gross trips through history, a quick like or subscribe goes a long way, just like a spoonful of lard in a biscuit. And hey, drop a comment with your city and your local time. I'd love to know who else is still awake and trying not to imagine cowboy farts in surround sound. Now lie back, close your eyes, and listen carefully. You wake up on the open prairie, crammed beneath a canvas tarp that smells like wet dog and dried sweat. The night air is still clinging to your bones, but the rising sun is already roasting your face like an overcooked flank steak. Your back is sore, your boots are damp, and your stomach is making a sound that could summon coyotes. Welcome to the American West. It's 1876. You're a drover on a cattle drive, and if you don't eat something greasy and half-burnt in the next 10 minutes, you might not make it to noon. You roll out of your blanket, brush a scorpion off your hat, and trudge toward the smell of biscuits, scorched beans, and coffee so black it might be illegal. Let's begin with beans, the backbone of cowboy digestion and the silent killer of campfire conversations. They were cheap, easy to store, and packed with just enough protein and fibre to keep you moving and rumbling. Pinto beans, navy beans, black-eyed peas, dried and hauled by the sackful in the chuckwagon. Cooking them was part science, part gamble. Ideally, they'd soak overnight in water, if you had any, and then simmer for hours until they were soft enough to eat without losing a tooth. Realistically, they were tossed into a pot with grease, maybe some salt, and whatever random ingredient cookie could find, usually bacon drippings, leftover pork grease, or even a splash of yesterday's coffee for depth. Flavour was optional, texture was chaos, and gastrointestinal aftermath guaranteed. Then came the biscuits, but not the fluffy buttery ones you're imagining. Cowboy biscuits were a frontier species all their own, born of flour, baking powder, lard, salt, and desperation. The dough was mixed directly in a dented tin bowl, probably next to a boot, and then dropped into a skillet or Dutch oven. No rolling pins, no cookie cutters, no love. Sometimes they were baked right in the coals, producing a crust that could crack dental fillings. Sometimes they were pan-fried in lard until golden brown and vaguely alive. Other times, they emerged like greyish pucks that steamed slightly when broken open, like prehistoric scones. These biscuits weren't fancy, but they were functional. They filled you up, soaked up bean juice, and doubled as currency in games of trail poker. One cowboy even used his biscuit as a hammer once. It worked. Now combine those two elements, beans and biscuits, and you've got the foundation of 90% of cowboy breakfasts. Throw in a slab of fried salt pork and a cup of burnt coffee, and you're well on your way to internal combustion. But why was this combo so common? Simple, it lasted. Beans kept forever when dried. Flour could survive weeks of bouncing around in a chuckwagon if kept in a tightly sealed sack, usually covered in flies anyway. Lard didn't need refrigeration, and salt pork, well, we'll cover that slab of sorrow in another sub-story. These foods didn't just feed the body, they fed the mission. Cattle drives could stretch for 1,000 miles or more from Texas to Kansas or Montana. Cowboys burned 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day, herding, roping, riding, and occasionally fighting off both rustlers and dysentery. They needed energy-dense, shelf-stable food, not avocado toast and oat milk lattes. The result? Meals that were heavy, repetitive, and sometimes borderline sentient. And oh, the side effects. Start with the beans. Even the most carefully cooked ones carried the risk of flatulence-related mutiny. Failing to soak or simmer them properly meant complex sugars stayed intact, the kind your gut bacteria love to ferment. The result? A symphony of backfire blasts by mid-morning, especially when 20 cowboys rode in a tight formation. As for the biscuits, well, chewing them built character and jaw muscles. You didn't eat a biscuit so much as survive it. Break one in half and it might echo, drop one and it could spark a small fire, and yet you cherished them because they beat chewing raw flour. Still, the most dangerous part of breakfast wasn't the ingredients, it was the routine. Every day started the same. Wake up cold, shuffle to the fire, receive a dented plate full of beans, biscuit and meat, and then shovel it in before the cattle scattered or your hat caught fire again. Breakfast wasn't a relaxing ritual. It was a fuel stop at a greasy gas station run by a man who hated seasoning and human joy. And yet, this routine was sacred. You didn't sass the cook. You didn't complain about the beans. You didn't mention that today's biscuit tasted like horsehoof. You nodded, muttered thanks, and ate what was handed to you. Because complaining got you double beans and a silent exile to the farting section of the herd. Historically, this all made sense. The American cowboy was a blend of many cultural influences: Mexican vaqueros, black freedmen, white settlers, Native Americans, and their food traditions collided on the trail. Frijoles met biscuits, cornmeal met salt pork. Everyone brought something, and everything was adapted to whatever could survive a month of dust and horse sweat. Flavours came second, calories came first, digestion optional, and so you learned to love the smell of bean steam at dawn. You convinced yourself that biscuit chunks floating in your coffee were bonus fibre. You didn't ask questions when a plate of breakfast made your eyes water. You just ate and prayed. So as you scrape the last bit of crusted bean out of your tin bowl, you reflect on what you've just endured. The beans were violent, the biscuits were medieval, and your stomach feels like it just lost a bar fight. But somehow, against all odds, you're still alive, which is good, because tomorrow it's beans and biscuits again. And the next day, and the next. You survived the beans, you gnawed your way through a biscuit, you even kept the salt pork down more or less. But now it's time to meet the thing behind the food, the dirty little secret of every cattle drive. It's not a saloon, it's not a barn, and it's definitely not a restaurant. It's the chuckwagon, the cowboy's kitchen, pantry, medicine cabinet, grease trap, rodent hotel, and, depending on how unlucky you were, open-air disease laboratory on wheels. And if you ever wondered how breakfast on the trail could taste like axle grease and old leather, the answer is waiting right here. Step a little closer, but not too close. It smells like regret. First things first, the word chuck didn't mean chuck as in toss your lunch, though that would have been fitting. It was slang for food, particularly the kind that was basic, heavy, and could survive being bounced across a prairie for 6 weeks in a wooden box. The chuckwagon was invented by a man named Charles Goodnight in the late 1860s, during the golden age of the cattle drive. Think of him as the Steve Jobs of cowboy cooking, except instead of iPhones, he rolled out a rolling coffin of lard and flour with a squeaky wheel and a wooden latch. Here's how it worked. The chuckwagon was usually a sturdy, modified army wagon or Conestoga-style freight cart with one key innovation: a chuck box mounted to the rear. This fold-down wooden cabinet opened into a kind of primitive kitchen counter. Inside, shelves, compartments, and tiny drawers stuffed with flour, sugar, salt, baking soda, coffee, and a rat or two. Underneath, a slop bucket, maybe a skillet or two, and the distinct aroma of disappointment. Everything else, the beans, the grease, the bacon slabs, the water barrel, was jammed somewhere between the wheels, under the tarp, or dangling from the sides like culinary Christmas ornaments. It was a mobile disaster, but it worked. And then came the cook. He was the one person you didn't backtalk, not because he was friendly, but because he controlled the food, the coffee, and indirectly your digestive fate. He could overcook your beans, forget your biscuit, or serve you the slice of salt pork that had already been dropped in the fire and picked up with a horseshoe. The cook's domain was sacred. He kept a strict hierarchy. The wagon was his temple, The fire was his altar, and you were a hungry heathen begging for crumbs. He might also double as the barber, the dentist, the unofficial judge, and the guy who told the trail boss to stop whining and eat his beans like a man. You did not mess with the cook, ever. Now here's where things get juicy, rather mouldy. You'd think a kitchen on wheels would prioritise cleanliness, given the raw meat, open fires, and lack of refrigeration. But this was the 1800s. Hygiene was something that happened in Paris, not on the plains. The flour sack, that canvas bag full of white powder, was a 5-star hotel for weevils. Shake it, and you'd see specks crawling like they paid rent. The lard tin, left out in the sun, crusted with flies and occasionally mistaken for a spittoon. The dried fruit bin, mostly dried, slightly fruit, partly mystery. The water barrel, best not look inside. It hadn't been empty since Arkansas. By modern standards, this wagon was a walking CDC case study. Cowboys regularly dealt with stomach cramps, food poisoning, and what polite society might call unpredictable evacuation. Some got scurvy, others got infections, everyone got gas. And yet, the chuckwagon kept rolling. You'd think after surviving a breakfast full of danger and protein-adjacent substances, you'd be able to relax. But the wagon didn't just cook meals, it also stored tools, bedrolls, ropes, and every piece of rusted kitchenware ever invented. The coffee pot was never washed. The bean pot was rinsed with coffee. The frying pan, just wiped with a rag and thrown back in the wagon. Leftovers were a concept best avoided. Whatever remained from breakfast usually reappeared as lunch, or as a surprise flavour in the next day's gravy. Add in the weather, rain, wind, desert dust, snow, and you had the perfect recipe for unpredictable results. Flour turned to paste, beans sprouted, bacon grew fuzz, and yet, Cookie kept cooking, because stopping wasn't an option. Let's not forget the animals. Yes, animals. The chuckwagon attracted them like a carcass in a cartoon. Flies by the thousands swarming every surface, ants marching into the biscuit tin, snakes curled under the firewood pile, coyotes sniffing for scraps, and sometimes a curious steer would wander up and eat the soap. The most persistent of all were the mice, who viewed the wagon as a travelling buffet. They nibbled everything: flour, lard, soap, matches, leather straps, and then left little gifts behind, which, more often than not, made their way into the next pot of beans. Extra protein, you're welcome. Despite all this chaos, the chuckwagon was a lifeline. It brought order to the dusty madness of trail life. It was the first thing set up at camp and the last thing packed before moving. Cowboys used it to gather, complain, flirt with hypothermia, and argue over who had the worst bowel situation. And it wasn't just about food. The chuckwagon was also where wounds were patched, badly, disputes were settled, with coffee, and memories were burned into your brain like a lard-glazed fever dream. Historically, this one wagon played an outsized role in shaping frontier culture. As cattle drives stretched across Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, and beyond, the chuckwagon became a symbol of American endurance. It wasn't glamorous, but it was tough, reliable, and slightly sticky. It fed thousands of men, inspired cowboy poetry, and over time evolved into something more romantic in the American mythos. Today, reenactments and cowboy cook-offs try to recapture that magic. But the modern versions, they use hand sanitizer, they refrigerate the meat, the beans don't scream when you chew them. In short, they're fake. You haven't really lived the chuckwagon experience until you fished a lizard out of your biscuit dough and eaten the biscuit anyway. So now, as you step back from the wagon, eyes watering, nose offended, stomach wary, you realise something. The chuckwagon wasn't just the source of your breakfast. It was a test of strength, of tolerance, of how many mystery ingredients your intestines could process before declaring war. And the answer most days was, just barely. Now let's dive deep into the real power on the prairie. The man behind the skillet, the ladle-wielding lunatic, the one soul who could make or break your day before the sun even rose. He's not the trail boss, he's not the foreman, he's not even entirely sober, he's the camp cook, and if you know what's good for you, you'll shut up, hold out your plate, and say thank you. It starts with a voice like sandpaper, and a face that looks like it's been grilled over mesquite. The cook's already up when you roll out of your bedroll, clanging pots, stoking the fire and cursing the wind. His hands are covered in flour, soot, and something that might be bacon or might be a small animal. His apron, if he's wearing one, has seen battles you don't speak of. His mood, somewhere between thunderstorm and volcano. You approach cautiously, like he's a wild animal that just learned how to fry things. Why the fear? Because the cook, quite simply, was king of the chuckwagon, and that made him the most powerful man on the trail, not holding a rope or a revolver. Sure, the trail boss gave orders, but Cookie controlled the beans. And when your life revolved around dusty rides, bitter cold, and saddle sores in places you didn't know had nerves, the only thing standing between you and total collapse was food, or something like food. The cook controlled when you ate what you ate, whether it was hot, edible, or actively trying to escape. He also brewed the coffee, a position of terrifying importance. Trail cooks had to wake up hours before anyone else. The cattle needed to be moving by dawn, and cowboys didn't move without coffee, bacon grease, and beans that clung to the inside of your tin bowl like wet concrete. So the cook lit the fire, stoked the coals, pulled water from the barrel, probably full of bugs, mixed the biscuit dough, boiled the coffee pot until it screamed, all while the rest of you were still dreaming about rain and underwear. He did this in wind, snow, hail, dust, and sometimes with only a rusty pan and a spoon held together with wire. He had to deal with spilled flour, broken eggs, spoiled meat, lost ingredients, and hungover cowhands who wouldn't stop trying to help. Helping was the greatest insult you could offer a trail cook. Helping meant you thought he was slow. Helping meant he might let the beans burn on purpose next time. And yet, despite the grumbling and the threat of coffee-related homicide, the cook held a sacred position. He was a weird hybrid of mother, surgeon, referee, and tyrant. He patched wounds, pulled teeth, mediated disputes over whose horse kicked whom. He even served as the camp postmaster, guarding letters, notes, and sometimes bottles of medicine that definitely weren't medicine. His personality varied. Some were cheerful, most were feral, some were ex-soldiers, others were former outlaws. Many had nicknames like Greasepan, Biscuit Joe, or Mad Pancho, and almost all of them had at least one horrifying signature dish, usually involving burnt ends of something, coffee grounds as seasoning, an entire squirrel, optional but encouraged. Let's talk about the rules, unspoken but deeply enforced. Rule 1. You eat what you're given. No substitutions, no I'm gluten-free, no can I get that with less lard. You're lucky if your plate doesn't still have yesterday's breakfast on it. Rule 2. You never insult the food, even if it tastes like boot leather soaked in axle grease. A single snide remark could earn you the special portion, suspiciously colder, mushier, or crunchier than everyone else's. Rule 3. Never ask when breakfast is ready. It'll be ready when the cook stops cursing and the spoon no longer sticks straight up in the beans. Rule 4. If you break something, a cup, a pot, your own dignity, you fix it or get out. Rule 5. Compliment the coffee, even if it tastes like punishment. Ah yes, the coffee. It deserves its own warning label. Cooked in the same pot every day over open flame using water of questionable origin, trail coffee was thick, black, and alive in spirit, if not in biology. It was often brewed with crushed eggshells to settle the grounds. Sometimes added were pine needles, cinnamon bark, or chewing tobacco, depending on what was nearby and how much the cook disliked you. And yet you drank it. Because if you didn't, your head would feel like a cow sat on it by mid-morning. The cook knew this. He knew he had the power, and you feared him accordingly. Historically, the cook's status wasn't just tradition, it was survival logic. On long cattle drives, cowboys faced constant stress. Bad weather, stampedes, rattlesnakes, bandits, and worst of all, monotony. The food was the one constant that could either lift spirits or break morale. A good cook made the trail bearable, a bad one made it dangerous. Chuckwagon rules even became official law on some drives, enshrined in code books alongside pay rates and herd rules. Cooks could dock rations, assign cleanup duty, or in rare cases throw someone off the drive altogether, especially if they spilled the coffee. Some cattle companies even gave cooks their own horse and assistant, just to keep them from quitting mid-drive. Without the cook, the entire operation unravelled into hangar-fueled chaos. So now, you stare down your plate, steaming with beans, salt pork, and what might be a pine cone. The cook is watching you from behind the skillet, arms crossed, brow furrowed, waiting. You nod, you chew, you swallow, you pretend not to taste the regret, and you say thank you. Because deep down, you know, he may be grumpy, he may be unsanitary, he may be using the same spoon to stir everything from beans to shoe polish, but he's the reason you're still alive. And if you want to stay that way, you'll clean your plate and keep your opinions to yourself. You survived the cook's death glare. You chewed your way through a biscuit that doubled as personal armour. And now, it's time. The sun isn't even up yet, but you're already clutching a tin cup full of something dark, hot and steaming with menace. You raise it to your lips. The scent hits you first, like a campfire, a coal mine, and a slap from someone who doesn't like you very much. You take a sip, and your soul tries to leave your body. Congratulations, you're drinking Cowboy coffee, the original energy drink, brewed with equal parts bean, bitterness, and bad decisions. Let's start with the ingredients. Coffee beans, specifically green beans, raw, unroasted, imported in massive burlap sacks, often stored next to horses, soap, or whatever else happened to be in the chuckwagon. Cowboys roasted them themselves, if they were lucky, by dumping the beans into a skillet and shaking it over a flame until they turned a shade between burnt umber and ashtray. Roasting was more of an art than a science, and by art we mean accident. The beans came out uneven, half cracked, sometimes scorched, sometimes still raw. But once they were vaguely brown and hadn't caught on fire, they were declared done. Next came the grinding. Trail coffee grinders were rare, bulky, and often broken, so cowboys improvised. They used rocks, rifle butts, boot heels, or just crushed the beans with whatever wasn't currently being used as a spoon. The result wasn't so much a fine grind as a collection of random shards, powder, and possibly sand. And then, the brewing. No French press, no pour over, no fancy thermometers. Just a dented pot of river water, or worse, a handful of mystery grounds, and a roaring fire. The process was simple. Fill the pot with water, throw in the grounds, place directly over open flame, wait until the whole thing boils like a witch's cauldron, serve whenever the pot stops hissing. The boil time varied. Some cooks boiled their coffee for 10 minutes, others for 2 hours. One legendary cook was said to brew his coffee until the spoon stood straight up, unaided, and slightly wept. To separate the grounds, you had options. Let them sink to the bottom, cowboy filtration system. Throw in crushed eggshells to help them settle. Strain through a sock, or don't strain it at all and just chew your coffee like a man with nothing left to lose. And here's the kicker. Cowboys loved it. Not because it was good, it wasn't. It was jet fuel with a complex aftertaste of dirt, iron, and desperation. But out on the range, it kept you awake, alert, and alive. Cattle drives started before dawn. You might ride 16 hours straight in blistering heat, torrential rain, or high-altitude snow. Sleep was rare. Rattlesnakes were common. One bad night, and you'd be sleep riding your horse straight into a ravine. So you drank the coffee, you drank a lot. One cowboy was said to consume over 20 cups a day. Others kept mugs tied to their saddles, sipping between ropes and spurs. If the pot ran low, someone got punched. If the pot boiled over, someone got fired. If the pot went missing, the cook declared martial law. Now let's talk side effects. Drinking cowboy coffee came with consequences. Heart palpitations, standard, insomnia, required, hallucinations. That's just your horse's face melting from overcaffeination. Ignore it. Bathroom emergencies? We refer you back to the beans and the chuckwagon water barrel. And yet, quitting wasn't an option. Caffeine was the only reliable stimulant on the trail. It kept morale just high enough to prevent mutiny, and just low enough to avoid poetry. Coffee drinkers were slightly more alert, slightly less hostile, and occasionally lucid enough to dodge stampedes. Plus it served social purposes. Cowboys gathered around the pot like moths to a flame. It was where gossip was swapped, arguments started, and legends invented. Did you hear what Cookie put in the stew last night? Swear on my boots, a coyote took my blanket. Heard Jessie fell asleep in the water barrel again. Coffee was the glue that held the camp together. Bitter, scalding glue with the viscosity of syrup and the charm of shoe polish. Historically, cowboy coffee wasn't just a ritual. It was a frontier icon. In fact, the practice dates back to Civil War soldiers who boiled coffee grounds in tin cups and mess kits. When the war ended, those same men brought the habit west. By the time of the great cattle drives in the 1860s to 1880s, coffee had become a survival staple, more important than clean socks, and only slightly less sacred than the cook himself. Cowboy coffee was often unfiltered, unmeasured, and unforgiving, but it was reliable. It didn't spoil. It didn't need refrigeration. And unlike whiskey, it wouldn't get you thrown off the drive for accidental singing. Even today you'll find modern cowboys, real and reenactment, brewing cowboy-style coffee on campfires just to taste a piece of history. Most of them regret it, but it's tradition. A burnt, gritty, caffeinated tradition. So here you sit, cradling your third tin cup of the morning. Your vision's a little sharper, your hands are a little shakier, your stomach is politely asking why you drank something that tastes like molten asphalt. But you know the truth. You'd do it again tomorrow. Because this is the only thing standing between you and face planting into your horse's tail. You poke it with a fork and it jiggles. You poke it again. It doesn't stop jiggling. On your tin plate sits a slab of something grey, greasy, and slightly ominous. Like bacon if it had spent a few years in purgatory. It's curling at the edges. It smells like salted regret. And you're pretty sure it just blinked. Welcome to the wild, terrifying world of salt pork, the cowboy's mystery meat of choice, and quite possibly the leading cause of trail-based existential crises. So what exactly was this gelatinous marvel? Salt pork was essentially pork belly, the fatty underbelly of a pig, cured in enough salt to kill flavour, bacteria and optimism all at once. It was chopped into thick blocks, packed into barrels with layers of coarse salt, and then sealed up for storage. No refrigeration needed, no seasoning included, no mercy offered. By the time it reached you on the cattle trail, it had likely been bouncing in a hot wagon for weeks, if not months. The result? A slab of meat-like substance so intensely preserved, it looked like it had been carved out of a particularly sweaty statue. You didn't eat salt pork so much as you survived it. Trail cooks, being resourceful, or just desperate, did what they could to make the stuff edible. Step 1. Soak the slab in water, overnight if you had the time. Step 2. Boil it to get rid of excess salt, preferably twice. Step 3. Fry it in a skillet with enough lard to make a cardiologist cry. Step 4. Hope it doesn't fight back. If it still squeaked, smoked or oozed when poked, you'd fry it longer. If it was too hard to chew, you chopped it into beans. If it glowed slightly in the dark, you ignored it. But why was salt pork so common? because it lasted. This was the era before iceboxes, let alone fridges. Meat had to be preserved, and out on the open range, preservation meant salt, smoke or lies. Salt pork was cheap, easy to transport and nearly indestructible. As long as the barrel stayed sealed, the pork could last for months, sometimes years, a fact that should terrify you more than comfort you. It wasn't nutritious, it wasn't tasty, but it was fat-dense, high-calorie and made everything, and we mean everything, greasy. In fact, some cowboys would scoop the drippings from the skillet and use them to fry biscuits, cook beans, polish boots, or even waterproof their hats. That's right, it was multi-purpose meat grease, but salt pork had a dark side, several actually. Let's start with food poisoning. When improperly stored, say in a leaky barrel or a sun-baked wagon, or under someone's saddle for safekeeping, salt pork could turn on you. The outer layer might stay cured, but the inside, welcome to botulism roulette. No smell, no warning, just a sudden, violent need for a bush and a farewell note. Then there was trichinosis, a parasitic disease caused by eating undercooked pork. Symptoms included stomach pain, fever, swelling, and death. Medical care on the trail, limited to whiskey and a very stern talk. Cowboys knew the risks, but what were their options? You couldn't live on beans and coffee alone. You needed meat, even if that meat was older than some of the cows you were driving. Historically, salt pork has a long and greasy lineage. It was a staple for sailors, soldiers, and anyone else forced to eat in bulk without refrigeration. The US military issued it as rations during the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and beyond. By the time cattle drives took over the American West, salt pork was already an old, untrustworthy friend. The chuckwagon typically carried barrels of it, sliced off hunks as needed, and hoped the sun didn't get too curious. And yes, it was used in everything. Breakfast, fried and slapped next to beans. Lunch, refried and stuffed in biscuits. Dinner, reheated in the same skillet from breakfast. Dessert, just kidding. Or were they? You might wonder why they didn't just hunt for meat. Well, they did, occasionally. Cowboys would shoot the odd rabbit, squirrel, prairie chicken, or unlucky bird. But meat like that had to be cooked immediately, eaten quickly, and couldn't be relied on. Salt pork, for all its sins, was consistent. You knew what you were getting: fat, salt, and a spiritual challenge. And now you sit staring at your slice of pork. It glistens in the morning sun like a challenge from nature itself. The edges have curled into a shape suspiciously like a smile. You take a bite. The salt hits first, then the fat, then the texture, somewhere between a damp towel and a leather boot. You chew some more, you stop to question your life choices, and then you swallow, and live to chew again. You've done it. You've eaten the unkillable meat, and you might explode later, but for now, you're a cowboy. And cowboys don't flinch at pork that's older than their saddle. You hear it before you see it, a loud thunk as something solid hits your tin plate. It doesn't bounce, it doesn't steam, it just sits there, a warm beige rectangle with the mass of a paving stone and the emotional energy of a threat. The biscuit has arrived, and it is unyielding. If you thought cowboy food peaked at greasy beans and salted boot meat, then friend, you haven't yet been introduced to the carbohydrate sledgehammer that powered the American West, the biscuit. No, not the flaky golden ones from TV commercials that melt in your mouth and float in a buttery dream. We're talking about frontier biscuits, dense, dusty, and capable of surviving artillery fire. These weren't just food, they were tools, they were weapons, they were almost certainly accidents. Let's talk basics. A traditional cowboy biscuit was made from the holy trinity of chuckwagon baking: flour, baking powder, and lard, with a splash of water or sour milk if available, and salt if the cook remembered. There were no measuring cups, no kitchen timers, no ovens. Everything was mixed by hand, slapped together in a cracked tin bowl, and baked over an open flame or inside a Dutch oven buried in the coals. That's it. Which explains why every bite tasted like a mouthful of regrets. Now, a well-made biscuit could be decent, occasionally even fluffy. But let's be honest, the average biscuit on the cattle trail had the texture of dry clay and the density of guilt. Why? Because conditions were terrible for baking. You had fluctuating fire temperatures, unpredictable ingredients, and cookware that hadn't been cleaned since the Mexican-American War. If it rained, the flour got clumpy. If it was dry, the dough cracked like a desert. If the cook was in a mood, and he always was, the biscuits were either burnt on the outside or raw in the middle, sometimes both. And once made, they were stored wherever space could be found, in saddlebags, bedrolls, or under someone's hat. By the time they reached your plate, they might have absorbed smoke, dust, bacon drippings, or boot polish. The result? A biscuit that was roughly 60% flour, 30% confusion, 10% small pebbles, probably accidental. And yes, there are documented cases of cowboys using leftover biscuits to plug holes in wagons, prop up broken tent poles, or, in the infamous incident of 1879, hurl them during a campfire disagreement that escalated into what can only be described as a bread-based melee. It's true. In Kansas, 1879, a group of trail-weary cowboys reportedly got into an argument over who had taken the last decent biscuit. Words were exchanged, accusations flew, and then so did the biscuits. What began as shouting turned into a full-scale flour-flinging fiasco, with men ducking behind barrels, shielding themselves with plates, and hurling rock-hard baked goods across the fire like medieval siege weapons. One biscuit reportedly shattered a coffee pot. Another knocked a man unconscious. 2 horses fled into the darkness. From that day on, the cook began serving biscuits with a warning, and sometimes a helmet. But where did this chewy chaos come from? Well, cowboy biscuits descended from an older, more sinister ancestor, hardtack. Hardtack was a Civil War-era staple, a bland, brutally dry cracker made from flour and water, baked until nearly fossilized. It could last for years, and often did. Soldiers used to tap their hardtack to dislodge weevils before eating. Some soaked it in coffee, others just gave up and chewed their boots. By the time of the cattle drive, cowboys were still dealing with its influence. While most trail cooks had upgraded to baking soda and lard, the DNA of hardtack lingered in every overly firm bite. And then there were the Dutch oven disasters. The Dutch oven was a cast-iron pot with a lid and short legs, ideal for baking in the coals. You'd nestle it in the fire, pile hot coals on top and pray. Biscuits cooked in these contraptions were either lightly warmed and still raw inside, incinerated beyond reason, or rarely just right, but only if you sacrificed a sock to the fire gods. Cooks didn't check doneness with toothpicks. They judged by smell, instinct, and whether the dough let out a hiss when poked. If you got a biscuit that wasn't blackened, you were lucky. If you got one that was edible without sauce, you were blessed. And yet, biscuits endured. Because they were cheap, they were filling, and when paired with beans and pork grease, they gave you the necessary caloric wallop to survive a day in the saddle. Biscuits also soaked up everything: gravy, coffee, tears, and could be used to push food into your mouth when your fork gave up. They were the unsung hero of cowboy breakfasts, and sometimes the most dangerous. So you've cracked your tooth, fractured your pride, and chipped a skillet on the side of your biscuit. You've accepted that it's not going to flake, crumble, or yield to mortal chewing. The fire's dying down, the coffee tastes like shoe polish, but you're still holding this baked projectile in your hand like a challenge from the carbohydrate gods. And then, from across the fire, you hear someone mutter, "Might be better tomorrow." Wait, what? Welcome to the horrifying frontier practice of biscuit rebaking. Yes, rebaking. As in, we didn't eat these yesterday, so let's warm them up, scrape off the soot and pretend they're fresh. It wasn't just common, It was almost a tradition. The cook, trying to save time and flour, would throw leftover biscuits into the skillet the next morning, splash on a little lard, or yesterday's pork fat, and refry the entire batch. The outside would get crispier, the inside would stay questionably moist, and the flavour, somewhere between campfire, belt leather and regret. These weren't twice-baked delights. They were flour fossils, and yet trail-hardened cowboys swallowed them without blinking. Why? Because breakfast wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival, and if that meant gnawing on day-old dough that could stop a bullet, so be it. But cowboy biscuits weren't just food. On the trail, these crusty carb slabs had dozens of alternate uses. For example, weaponry, tossed like rocks during cook-fueled fistfights, or used to drive off curious coyotes. Repair tools, wedged under a broken wagon wheel or used as improvised hammering blocks. Currency, traded in poker games when money ran dry. I see your lard chip and raise you 2 stale biscuits. Jokes, hidden in someone's bedroll as a prank or slipped into a hat for a crunchy surprise. Art. One cowboy reportedly carved a biscuit into the shape of his long-lost sweetheart. It later disintegrated in the rain. Symbolism. And for cooks, biscuits were a measure of respect. Make them well, soft inside, golden on the bottom, and you were a chuckwagon legend. Make them badly, burnt, cracked, or accidentally fused to the pan, and you'd hear about it for weeks. Quietly, of course, because no one said it to the cook. They valued their remaining teeth. Let's get serious for a second, because biscuits tell us something deep about cowboy life. They represent the frontier compromise. You got what you needed, not what you wanted. Cowboys didn't expect perfect meals. They expected calories, portability, and a brief moment of warmth before another 10-hour ride through dust and silence. A biscuit could do that. Maybe not well, maybe not even safely, but it did the job. And while the biscuit was humble, it was also universal. From the Texas plains to the Montana hills, every cattle drive had biscuits. Black cowboys, white cowboys, vaqueros, they all knew the taste. It was one of the few culinary experiences everyone shared, along with the digestive fallout. There were even attempts at variation. Some cooks added baking soda, sour milk or animal fat to improve flavour. Others stirred in bacon bits, dried fruit, or leftover beans. One trail legend involved a cook who accidentally dropped chewing tobacco into the batter and didn't tell anyone. The cowboys said it was the best batch they ever had. They slept for 14 hours and woke up seeing colours. Of course, some modern romanticisers claim these biscuits were rustic, authentic, or soulful. But those people have never eaten a 36-hour-old grease biscuit with a beetle in it. Today's biscuits come with butter pats and honey. Yesterday's biscuits came with a tetanus risk and a side of ash. And yet, in all their hard-edged, rock-solid, dental sabotaging glory, they were beloved, or at least tolerated with the quiet dignity of someone who knew there was nothing else on the plate. Because once you've had salt pork and coffee sludge, a biscuit brick feels like a warm hug from someone who doesn't like you very much, but still wants you alive. So now, with your jaw sore and your dignity dented, you wrap the remaining half of your biscuit in a cloth and tuck it into your saddlebag. Not because you'll eat it later, but because you might need to defend yourself with it tomorrow. They're back. You stare down at your tin plate. The familiar brownish slop glistens under the morning sun, steaming gently like it just whispered something ominous. The smell hits your nose, smoky, earthy, slightly peppery, and unmistakably bean forward. You look up at the cook. He says nothing. He knows. Because beans aren't just breakfast out here. They're a way of life, a bubbling, belly-rumbling, relationship-ending way of life. Cowboys ate beans the way modern people drink coffee, constantly, automatically, and without questioning the consequences. Why? Because beans were cheap, long-lasting, satisfying, and when cooked right, almost nutritious. The cowboy's relationship with beans was like an arranged marriage, not always loving, but undeniably practical. And once you committed, you were in it for the long haul, emotionally and gastrointestinally. Let's start with the logistics. Beans travelled well. Dried beans, especially pintos, navies and black beans, were staple items in every chuckwagon stores. Stored in burlap sacks and stashed away from water and rodents, in theory, they could last months, even in the brutal heat and dust of the open range. Each morning, or sometimes the night before, the cook would pull out a few scoops of beans and soak them, ideally overnight. This softened the bean skins and reduced cooking time. It also, as any cowboy worth his boots would tell you, helped lessen the side effects. If he had enough water and patience, he'd boil them low and slow for several hours. If he didn't, well, you were going to have a bad day. Now here's where it gets dicey. Undercooked beans aren't just unpleasant. They're a form of digestive betrayal, chewy on the outside, grainy in the middle, and practically designed to ferment the moment they hit your gut. But overcooked beans, they turn to mush, sludge, bean paste with the consistency of warm cement. The cook's challenge was finding the elusive middle ground, a soft, steamy, savoury bean with just enough texture to hold its shape, but not so much bite that it triggered an all-out stomach mutiny. And then there were the leftovers. Oh, the leftovers. See, the cowboy bean wasn't a one-time meal, it was a 3-day experience. Day 1, fresh off the fire, tender, smoky, and almost exciting. Day 2, reheated with lard, slightly drier, slightly spicier, still edible. Day 3, scraped from the bottom of the pot, mashed into a blackened crust and possibly used to patch saddle leather. At this point the beans were sentient and possibly angry. You still ate them, because what else was there? Historically speaking, beans were a cornerstone of frontier survival. Cowboys borrowed heavily from Mexican vaquero traditions, where beans had long been a staple alongside tortillas and chili. In fact, many chuckwagon recipes were adapted versions of frijoles or charro beans, spiced with dried chilies, bits of bacon, or the occasional onion if the cook was feeling fancy, or had found something sprouting near the latrine. But spice was rare, so was meat. Most of the time your beans were flavoured with nothing more than grease, salt, and the ambient flavour of yesterday's firewood. Still, they were filling, protein-rich, high in fibre, and alarmingly repeatable. And here lies the dilemma. Beans were good. Beans were necessary. Beans were also a threat to camp harmony. No one warned you about the aftershock, the slow rumble in your lower gut that builds like a thunderstorm rolling over the plains. 1 minute you're laughing with the boys. The next, you're discreetly backing away from the fire, eyes wide, stomach churning, praying for wind direction and open land. Cowboys developed tactical protocols around beans. You didn't sit downwind after breakfast, ever. You spaced out your bedroll at night, for safety. You never trusted a man who ate a second helping after dusk. One cook even posted a sign that read, "Beans after dark equals ride alone." And yet, cowboys couldn't quit them. There was something comforting about a warm pot of beans simmering over the fire after a brutal day in the saddle. The smell, the texture, the fact that it reminded you of home, even if home was a dirt shack with a goat inside it. You could jazz them up if you got lucky. Add salt pork for meaty depth. Stir in coffee for bitterness, yes, really. Mix with old biscuit crumbs to stretch it out. Top with bear fat for the full frontier effect. Also, yes, really. Some cowboys claimed beans helped them think clearer. Others swore they kept the rattlesnakes away. One man insisted his rifle fired straighter after a plate of morning thunder stew. No one tested it. No one wanted to be downwind. Let's say it's day 19 of the cattle drive. Your boots are cracked. Your hat smells like scorched bacon. You've seen 6 scorpions and buried 2 spoons. And still, somehow, you find yourself staring down at another bowl of beans. No one speaks. They just eat, slow and resigned, the way you might approach a final exam or a haunted stew. There's no escape, no variation, no explanation for why one bite is buttery perfection and the next tastes like bark. This is bean life. But here's the kicker. Not all bean pots were created equal. As cowboys crisscrossed the American West, from Texas to Wyoming, Colorado to California, they encountered different regional takes on the humble legume. Sure, most were bad, but a few had potential. In Texas, beans were often cooked with salt pork or beef drippings, thanks to the influence of Mexican vaqueros and southern settlers. If you were lucky, there might be a chili pepper or two thrown in, just enough heat to mask the taste of iron skillet and singed sock. In New Mexico, the beans were spicier, sometimes layered with dried chilies, garlic or lard. Cowboys passing through would remember the flavour. They'd also remember the next 12 hours. Up north, especially near Montana or Dakota territory, beans were plainer, bland, starchy and seasoned only by the dust in the wind. These beans were so flavourless that one cowboy famously said they tasted like someone boiled a boot and whispered bean at it. Despite these variations, most cowboys agreed on a few universal truths, rules so sacred they might as well have been etched on a tin plate. 1. Never trust a bean on day 4. If you're seeing the same pot of beans 4 days in a row, something's gone terribly wrong. Either you've slipped into a temporal loop, or the cook is playing a game of what happens if. 2. Don't ask what's in the pot. If it smells like beans and looks like beans, just eat it. Asking questions leads to answers like, yesterday's biscuit mush, whatever the mule stepped in, or don't worry about it. 3. The fire is not for cooking, it's for escape. When the post-bean side effects kick in, you either move closer to the flames for warmth, or further away for everyone else's survival. 4. Beans before bathing, always. Hygiene came second, always. The cowboy would skip a week of washing if it meant getting first dibs on the fresh pot. As one saying went, clean hands lose meals, dirty hands hold beans. And then there were the legends, because when you're riding 50 miles a day with nothing but a stomach full of protein shrapnel, stories get weird. Like the tale of Old Guts Johnson, a drover who once ate 3 plates of fire-roasted beans, rode bareback through a lightning storm, and emerged claiming he had seen eternity in a fart cloud. Or the rumour that one chuckwagon's beans were so deadly they were used to disable rival herds. A friendly dinner, a shared pot. 12 hours later, the competition was down for the count, and the cattle had moved on. One group swore by bean premonitions. If your pot burbled a certain way, it meant rain. If it hissed, it meant danger. If it farted before you even stirred it, you best ride fast and ride alone. But deep down, beans represented something more than just fuel. They were the thread that tied cowboy life together, unglamorous, reliable, and quietly chaotic. No matter where you rode, who you were, or what your boots had stepped in, the bean was always there. It was the equalizer, the unifier, the background hum in a world that didn't care if you got fed, just that you kept moving. Even cowboys who hated beans ate them with reverence. You didn't have to like them, you just had to respect them, and if you didn't, well, you'd find out what trail justice meant the next time you stole a fresh spoonful and ignored the cook's warning glare. So now, sitting by the fire, your belly softly gurgling like a baby volcano, you come to a realization. The beans have won. You are now one with the bean. You smell like them. You think like them. You will likely dream in brown, bubble-filled landscapes tonight, and in the morning, they'll be waiting again, hot, hearty, slightly vengeful. Because beans aren't just breakfast. They're a commitment. You wake up with a strange sensation coating your mouth. Something heavy, filmy, and faintly meat-scented. The air smells like someone deep-fried a memory. You roll over, sit up, and watch as the cook lobs a dripping mass into a smoking pan, with a sound that could only be described as dangerously wet. That smell! It's not meat. It's not even really food. It's lard. And today, like most days, it's going to be the entire flavour profile of your breakfast. Out here on the open range, lard isn't a side ingredient. It's not a secret touch. It's not even optional. Lard is breakfast. Lard is lunch. Lard is spiritual. Whether you're frying salt pork, greasing the biscuit pan, or reviving 3-day-old beans, lard is the foundation, the filler, and sometimes the fire hazard. Bacon drippings are considered liquid gold. Suet, that's the raw, crumbly fat from around a cow's kidneys, is prized like it's exotic butter. And bear grease? Let's just say it adds a certain flavour you don't forget no matter how hard you try. The reason for all this fat worship is simple: survival. The cattle drive burned more calories than any dietitian could count. You rode from sunup to sundown, burned through boots, and sometimes ate dinner still wearing dust in your teeth. You needed fuel, and fat delivered. A spoonful of grease packed more energy than a slab of dry beef. It was cheap, easy to store, and, in theory, made everything taste better. At least that's what the cook claimed as he scraped lard from a pan he hadn't washed since the last thunderstorm. Of course, it wasn't just about taste or energy. Fat was texture. Fat was glue. If your biscuits were dry, smear some lard on top. If your beans had the consistency of muddy water, stir in a spoonful of pork grease to thicken it into a spreadable nightmare. If your salt pork had started to crisp too fast, add more lard to slow it down and make sure your arteries never catch a break. Even coffee pots weren't immune. Some cooks wiped their pots down with a bit of bacon fat to keep rust off, which, depending on your sense of taste, either improved the brew or ruined your entire morning. There was no such thing as too much grease. Plates were never wiped, just licked. Pans were cleaned by frying more food in them. Napkins didn't exist because your pants absorbed everything they needed to. Cowboys walked around with hands that glistened in the sun and moustaches that had absorbed so much animal fat they were technically edible. The smell never left you. It baked into your clothes, settled into your hair, and hovered around camp like a ghost of breakfast past. But with all that lard came consequences. Most cowboys walked around with stomachs in open rebellion. A breakfast of fried beans, biscuits basted in pork drippings, and half-melted fat cubes posing as meat didn't just sit in your belly. It marched around, asked questions, and occasionally tried to escape. Flatulence was common. So were mysterious cramps. Some men claimed they could predict weather shifts by the way their gut churned after a double-greased breakfast. Others just got very quiet and walked toward the nearest bush. Still, no one questioned the grease. You couldn't. There was no butter, no oil, no refrigeration. If you didn't cook with lard, you didn't cook at all. It kept food from burning. It stretched meals farther. It coated pans so well that nothing ever stuck to them, except for your will to live after the third helping of lard-drenched beans. And in winter, lard did double duty. Cowboys smeared it on cracked lips, blistered hands, even boot leather. It was the Swiss Army knife of animal fat, and you respected it, or suffered the consequences. Some cowboys got creative. One legendary cook reportedly invented a lard pie, which involved a crust made entirely of fat, filled with dried apple mush, and topped with a sizzling layer of bacon bits. Men swore it gave them vivid dreams. Others never recovered. Another trail tale tells of a drover who tried to fry his biscuit in bear grease and ended up smelling like wet dog for 3 days, attracting wolves, cougars, and one very confused raccoon. The truth is, frontier food had one flavour: grease. Everything tasted like the thing that had been cooked before it. Beans tasted like salt pork. Biscuits tasted like beans. Bacon tasted like lard-soaked flour and burnt coffee. And through it all the lard kept coming, poured from a dented tin, scooped from a repurposed tobacco tin, or just scraped off yesterday's frying pan. It didn't go bad because it had already gone beyond. It existed in a state of eternal shimmer, both disgusting and essential. You finish your breakfast slowly, mouth coated in a film you could probably use to seal a roof. Your hands shine, your beard glistens, your gut feels heavier than your saddle, but you're warm, full, and still conscious. That counts as a victory. And tomorrow morning, when the cook asks if you want your beans fried or extra fried, you'll nod. You'll accept the ladle of grease, and you'll swallow your pride and about 3 ounces of melted pig in one gulp. Because out here, lard isn't just food. It's the glue that holds your breakfast together, your body upright, and your dignity in check. And if it tries to kill you, that's fine. It's probably just trying to keep you warm. You smell something sharp, something sour, something vaguely alive. It's coming from the tin plate the cook just handed you, and as your eyes adjust to the horror, you realise today's culinary adventure involves a side of sludge and a mystery smear that might once have been a tomato, or tobacco spit. It's hard to tell. There's no ketchup, no mustard, definitely no hot sauce. Welcome to the world of cowboy condiments, where seasoning was less about flavour and more about sheer survival instinct. Out here, meals weren't designed for taste. They were designed for caloric punishment. A greasy slab of salt pork, a scoop of yesterday's beans, a scorched biscuit, all held together by the faint hope that something, anything, might give it flavour. But store-bought condiments? That was a fantasy. Ketchup was a rare delicacy, mustard even rarer. Mayonnaise wasn't even a concept, and if you ever said aioli around the cook, he'd probably throw a horseshoe at you. If you wanted your meal to taste like something other than regret, you got creative. Some cowboys carried pouches of dried herbs they'd scavenged from the trail. Wild onion, desert sage, maybe a pinch of dried chili if they'd passed through New Mexico in a previous life. These were used sparingly, reverently, 1 pinch per pot, if that. You didn't waste flavour on just any breakfast. It had to earn it. More often, though, the seasoning came from less noble sources. Dirt, for example, was inevitable. Every chuckwagon meal came with a generous sprinkling of prairie dust, kicked up by boots, horses, and wind that seemed personally offended by your attempt to eat. Your biscuit had a crunch. That was probably sand. Your beans tasted earthy. That's because they were, literally. Then there was the grease, because why season when you can smother? Bacon drippings, pork fat, and yesterday's frying pan residue gave every bite a smoky, borderline rancid depth that could only be described as frontier umami. A good cook knew how to reuse every drop of oil from yesterday's disaster. A great cook didn't tell you what was floating in it. When all else failed, cowboys turned to what they had in their mouths anyway: tobacco. Chewing tobacco wasn't just a bad habit. It was a lifestyle, a social activity, and occasionally, a condiment. A few unhinged individuals swore that a tiny smear of tobacco juice could add spice to an otherwise bland bowl of beans. No one asked them to elaborate. Others simply dribbled near the fire while eating, accidentally seasoning their boots and possibly their neighbours. Salt was slightly more available, but always rationed. It was used first on meat, second on beans, and rarely, very rarely, on anything else. If a cowboy salted his biscuit, he was either deeply depressed or trying to start a fight. Pepper, on the other hand, was a unicorn. The only kind most cowboys knew came from memories in the backs of old trading posts. Some tried to make their own concoctions. One infamous trail boss mixed vinegar, bean juice, and ashes to create what he called cowboy sauce. It tasted like regret and cleaning fluid, but he claimed it kept him regular. Another cooked down berries into a purple syrup so sour it stripped the enamel off your teeth. You'd drizzle it over a biscuit, cry a little, and pretend it was dessert. In the absence of taste, presentation didn't help. Cowboy condiments came in unmarked tins, old canteen flasks, or were just poured directly from whatever the cook was holding. One particularly resourceful cook used a buffalo horn to store bacon grease and dispensed it with dramatic flair, like some unholy fat wizard. The truth was, most cowboys stopped caring. After 2 weeks of salt pork and bean mush, your taste buds surrendered. Everything began to taste like soot, grease and coffee anyway. Breakfast became more about texture, crunchy or soft, gummy or charred, and less about flavour. If something actually tasted like anything, that was a red flag. And yet cowboys craved flavour, even a hint. A bite that burned or a spoonful that didn't taste like the bottom of a boot was enough to lift spirits and start gossip. Rumours would spread fast if a camp got its hands on a jar of real pickles or molasses. Some men would trade socks, horseshoes, or questionable favours for a single dab of store-bought mustard. There are stories of cowboys chasing down supply wagons on foot just to lick the inside of a pepper tin. So now, as you chew your way through your lard-glazed biscuit and bean glue patty, you find yourself fantasizing. Not about women, not about home, but about ketchup. Bright red, tangy, smooth ketchup, maybe even with a dash of salt. You blink, clear your head, and swallow. That's not ketchup on your plate, it's mud. You eat it anyway. Because out here, seasoning isn't something you taste, it's something you hallucinate, and if you're lucky, the tobacco spit wasn't yours. You start developing a craving, not for beans, not for biscuits, not even for lard-soaked salt pork. No, what you want for once is something with a crunch, something light, something civilized, maybe a little oats, some grain, something the body might actually recognize as nourishment instead of edible punishment. You glance at the cook's table, hopeful. But no, you're not a horse, and only the horses get oats. This is one of the cruelest truths of cowboy life. The horses were, in many ways, eating better than you. While you gnawed your way through recycled beans and fried pig grease, your horse was off in the corner, munching happily on a nosebag full of fresh, dry oats. Whole grain, nutrient-rich, and oddly fragrant in a way your biscuits never were. It's insulting, honestly. The oats were right there, packed into sacks in the wagon, carried all the way from the nearest town or army fort, shielded from dust and weevils, guarded like gold. Not for human consumption, not even in emergencies. Those precious grains were reserved for the animals, the ones with hooves, better digestion, and absolutely no idea how lucky they were. The reason was practical, of course. Horses powered the drive. Without them, cowboys didn't ride, cattle didn't move, and no one got paid. A cowboy with no horse was just a very angry pedestrian with sore feet. So the oats went to the horses, even when supplies ran low, even when you'd already eaten the last of the bacon fat and were considering boiling your belt. But still, you looked at those sacks with suspicion. The oats were dry, sure, but not mouldy. They weren't crawling with weevils. They didn't come coated in a mysterious film of pork residue. They weren't reused 3 times and flavoured with lard and failure. They looked clean, decent, almost hopeful. Some cowboys cracked under the pressure. A handful of desperate men were known to sneak a few handfuls of oats, boil them into a thin, bitter gruel and eat in secret, squatting behind cactus, spooning sadness into their mouths while keeping one eye out for the cook. Getting caught meant shame, mockery, and sometimes expulsion. Not because the cook cared about rules, but because horse feed was more valuable than you. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You were riding 16 hours a day, wrestling steers, sleeping in the dirt, losing toenails to frostbite, and the one thing that might have made your breakfast tolerable was strictly off limits because your horse needed its strength. The same horse that had tried to buck you off a cliff 2 days ago. The same horse that farted in your face while you were tightening its saddle. That horse? Yeah, it got the oats. Instead, your grain intake came from flour, bleached, bug-bitten and baked into something that had the consistency of broken roof tiles. The biscuits made from it were so dense they could survive a fall from the chuckwagon, bounce twice, and still be served for breakfast. You'd chew them while your horse munched fresh grain with the satisfied look of a noble beast who didn't have to pretend this was food. And don't even think about eating horse feed directly. Oats were raw, whole, difficult to digest. Without soaking or boiling, they'd sit in your gut like pocket gravel. Chew them wrong and you'd chip a tooth. Swallow too many and you'd find yourself praying for rain, fibre and divine intervention. Still, there were moments, weak, shameful moments, where a cowboy might sneak a few into his coffee, hoping for some kind of rustic cowboy oatmeal. The result was usually disappointment. Soggy, floating oat pebbles in a cup of soot-flavoured mud water. But it was something. It made you feel almost human. Briefly. The horses didn't appreciate it either. They chewed those oats with smug rhythmic confidence, tails flicking as if to say, "Enjoy your lard soup, 2 legs." You'd lock eyes with your mount in the early morning gloom, both of you chewing, both of you dead-eyed, but only one of you chewing food that was actually edible. Even more insulting was that horses didn't have to worry about food poisoning. They weren't eating salt pork that had been stored under a saddle for a week. They weren't spooning cold beans out of a soot-black pot at 4 a.m. They weren't offered biscuit shards with the consistency of firewood. Number they got dry, clean oats morning and night, and never once said thank you. And yet, you never dared complain. Not seriously. Not out loud. Because the last thing you wanted was to get hurt, have your horse wander off, and find yourself walking 50 miles through sagebrush with nothing but a sack of flour and a lard slick biscuit. Suddenly the horse wasn't just a beast of burden. It was your oat-powered lifeline. So you ate your beans, you sucked down your salt pork, you gnawed your fire-hardened biscuit and drank your gritty coffee, and every now and then, while pretending not to stare, you watched your horse eating a fresh bag of oats with the kind of casual luxury normally reserved for kings. You tell yourself you're not jealous, but deep down you know the truth. The horse is eating better than you, and it's not even trying. The morning fire hisses as another damp log gives up the ghost, sending smoke curling over the blackened pan where your breakfast is technically cooking. You're not sure what's more alarming, the way the beans bubble like lava, or the fact that the biscuit you left by the fire started to char from the inside. The cook gives it a stir with a spoon that might also be a wrench. No one speaks, because everyone knows what's coming. Campfire cooking. The one thing separating cowboys from wild animals, and even that's debatable. Out here, there are no stoves, no timers, no ovens, just fire, iron, instinct, and the raw, primitive hope that whatever gets set over the flames doesn't come out blackened on the outside and raw on the inside. The fire is your friend until it isn't. One moment it's warming your beans, the next it's swallowing your dinner whole, spitting out a smouldering puck that smells like insult. Everything's cooked over open flame or coals, not controlled flame, not the gentle flicker of a fireplace. We're talking unpredictable, wind-whipped, fuel-starved prairie fire that could flare into a blast furnace with one gust or die to a whisper if someone spits on it wrong. And still, meals must be made. The cook bends low, eyes squinting against the smoke, face lit like a demon in the rising sparks, muttering curses older than the trail itself. The tools are simple, a Dutch oven, black with soot and probably older than everyone present. A coffee pot that looks like it once doubled as a cannonball. A cast iron skillet so heavy it could be used to knock sense into a steer. There are no spatulas, no tongs, just a big spoon, a knife with half a handle, and some heavy canvas mitts that are either scorched or alive. The biscuits? dropped directly into the Dutch oven, nestled among coals, and then buried under more coals like some kind of primitive baking experiment. You check them by smell, or by kicking the side of the pot and listening for the sound of internal screaming. The beans, always the beans, reheated, overcooked, and sticking to the sides of the pot like plaster. Stirred with whatever's nearby. An old stick, a bone, a busted ladle that's mostly rust and prayers. Burned beans are the norm. Not burning them is considered suspicious and dangerous. As for the meat, well, that's where it gets truly theatrical. Salt pork tossed into the skillet with a violent sizzle that sounds like a warning. The fat spits, crackles, sometimes explodes. You've seen men take cover behind saddles just to avoid a lard-based shrapnel incident. But you don't stop the cook. He's in his zone now, shirt open, face greasy, eyes narrowed like he's staring into a vision quest made entirely of bacon. Sometimes potatoes make an appearance, rare exotic creatures that show up when the chuckwagon gets resupplied, or someone trades a saddle blanket for a sack of root vegetables. You'd think they'd be roasted delicately. Nope. They're buried in the fire like corpses and dug out later with the delicacy of a badger raid. Half burnt on one side, rock hard on the other. Delicious if you're starving. And you are. There's no such thing as even heat. The fire has its own mood. Wind from the north. Your beans scorch. Rain the night before. Your biscuits steam like angry bread. Your meat cooks on one side and just thinks about cooking on the other. You learn to rotate things constantly, not for culinary precision, but to avoid giving your breakfast sentience. Flames lick everything, smoke coats every bite. If you can't taste fire, you're not eating cowboy food. It seeps in through the beans. It curls around the biscuit crust. It soaks into your clothes, your beard, your very bones. You could smell a cowboy meal cooking from a half-mile away, usually by the scent of scorched pork and mild panic. And yet, despite all the chaos, the cook makes it work. Somehow. He juggles pans over flame like a greasy sorcerer, flips biscuits with the edge of a knife, rescues a pot of coffee with his bare hands. He sweats, grunts, curses, and plates your meal with a look that says it's done, and don't complain at the same time. You sit on a log that's been kicked so many times it's smooth. Your plate is warm, your food is hot. That's good enough. You eat around the black parts. You ignore the coal dust on your biscuit. You chew slowly and hope your teeth hold out. Because campfire cooking isn't about flavour. It's about heat, smoke, survival, and ritual. It's about making something, anything, edible in a world where everything's trying to kill you, and most of it's succeeding. And when it's done, you don't scrape your plate. You just toss it on the wagon tongue, wipe your face on your sleeve, and let the fire take the rest. Because tomorrow it all starts again. One skillet, one cook, one flame, and way too many beans. The day starts like most days on the trail, with a rumble. Not from the thunderclouds rolling in over the prairie, but from your gut. A low, ominous churn that tells you one simple truth. Something inside you wants out, and it wants out now. You clutch your stomach, glance toward the horizon, and realise with a cold sweat that the nearest bush is at least half a mile away, and it's already occupied by a rattlesnake. This is the unspoken horror of cowboy life, not the shootouts, not the stampedes, not even the lard biscuits. No, it's what happens after breakfast. Because in the Wild West, the only thing more feared than an undercooked bean was what happened when it finally decided to cook inside you. Welcome to the sacred and terrifying moment known as breakfast regret. A daily gamble where you rolled the dice on whether that salt pork had gone off, whether the beans were fully soaked, and whether the coffee had been brewed with water or pond slime. You ate what was handed to you. You said thank you, and then you waited. Waited for the telltale signs, the gurgle, the tight clench, the sudden realization that you'd better start moving, and fast. Out on the cattle trail, food safety wasn't just an afterthought, it was a fantasy. The chuckwagon pantry was a rotating museum of might-still-be-edible ingredients. The beans were reused for days, often left in the pot overnight where they could soak up dust, flies, and the occasional mouse sneeze. The salt pork was stored in wooden barrels that may or may not have been sealed, salted, or inhabited by anything small and furry. And water. Let's not even talk about the water. Pulled from creeks, puddles, or barrels that had been filled 2 weeks ago and now had a distinct pond funk flavour. It was boiled sometimes, or just sloshed straight into the coffee pot where it boiled itself out of sheer shame. So when your food turned on you, and it would, the aftermath was swift and merciless. A sudden bead of sweat on your brow, a pang that felt like your intestines were tying a knot, and then the frantic decision: bush, ditch, or just suffer nobly and hope for the best. The desert, of course, offered no privacy, just open plains and shame. The forest wasn't much better. What little coverage there was came with thorns, snakes, and the constant risk of making eye contact with a fellow sufferer mid-squat. And heaven help you if you were on horseback when disaster struck. There are tales, whispered, never confirmed, of cowboys dismounting at full gallop, pants half down, diving into cactus patches just to preserve what little dignity they had left. Breakfast regret was such a regular part of cowboy life that it developed its own etiquette. You didn't ask questions, you didn't point, you didn't comment on anyone walking funny, clenching awkwardly, or suddenly sprinting into the brush. Everyone had their moment. Everyone carried the same haunted look. There were stories too. Legends of the Great Bean Incident, where a cook reused the same pot of beans for 5 days straight, only to send half the drive into gastrointestinal revolt by noon on day 6. They called it the brownout. For miles, nothing moved but the cattle and the frantic stomping of boots heading toward bushes. Then there was the infamous case of buzzard biscuit, a mysterious chunk of meat served one morning that even the dog wouldn't touch. The cook claimed it was pork. The smell claimed otherwise. 3 men ate it. 2 regretted it. The third never said a word again, just stared off into the distance with a look that suggested he'd seen things no man should ever see or digest. Out here, breakfast was always a gamble. Some days you got through it fine, full belly, light heart, maybe a mild burp. Other days, it was a countdown to disaster. You'd sit in your saddle, trying not to move too much, sweat beading on your brow, praying the next stampede was from cattle, not your own innards. The cook never apologised. He didn't have to. The code was clear. If it doesn't kill you outright, it's good enough. You ate it, you rode it out, and if necessary, you made your peace with the prairie. Because out here there was no Pepto, no toilet, no sympathy, only buzzards, and they were always watching. You haven't bathed in 2 weeks. Your hands are coated in a thin, translucent layer of bacon grease, dust, and what might be bean glue. There's something crusty under your fingernails, and your shirt smells like smoke, horse, and yesterday's regret. But none of that matters now, because the cook just rang the breakfast triangle, and out here on the range, food doesn't wait for soap. Hygiene was not a priority on the cattle trail. In fact, it wasn't even on the list. The average cowboy woke up filthy, ate filthy, worked filthy, and then went to sleep even filthier. And through it all, they shared plates, spoons, pots, and occasionally, without a hint of shame, the same side of a biscuit. If a cowboy got to wash his hands before eating, it meant he'd either fallen into a river or gotten bit by something and needed to check the wound. The idea of washing up before breakfast was laughable. There was no sink, no soap, no basin. The best you could hope for was a splash of lukewarm water from the community tin bucket, the same one the cook used to clean the coffee pot, boil beans, and sometimes soak his socks. If a cowboy dunked his hands in that water, it didn't clean them. It just redistributed the grime evenly across his fingers. So instead of worrying about cleanliness, trail etiquette focused on speed and silence. You shuffled into line, held out your tin plate, nodded at the cook, and accepted whatever mass of grease-soaked, bean-laced mystery he slopped into it. You didn't comment on the char, you didn't flinch when your salt pork wiggled, and you certainly didn't complain if there was a hair in your biscuit. It was probably yours anyway. Everyone ate fast. There was no savouring, no casual chewing. You shoved food in your mouth with greasy fingers, a soot-black spoon, or the biscuit itself, which acted as both utensil and napkin. If you dropped food, you picked it up. If someone else dropped food, they picked it up too, unless you were closer, in which case it became yours. Cups were communal. Coffee was poured into whatever vessel you had on hand, a cracked tin mug, a hollowed-out gourd, or the top of a dented canteen. You didn't rinse it between uses. You didn't ask what the last guy drank out of it. You just drank. Because the alternative was going thirsty, and the prairie sun didn't play fair. Trail etiquette dictated that no one made a big deal about germs. Germs were theoretical. Hunger was real. If a man coughed into his biscuit, no one blinked. If he sneezed into the bean pot, you thanked him for the extra seasoning. If someone licked his fingers and then used them to pull biscuits from the pile, you just hoped he wasn't the one with a rattlesnake bite that looked infected. And yet, despite the filth, there was a strange, unspoken order to it all. The cook had the only real authority, and his word was law. He could shame you in front of the group. He could slap your hand away from the biscuit tin. He could tell you to fetch water from a creek 2 miles away and you'd go, because challenging the cook meant starvation. Or worse, cold beans with no salt. Bathing, when it happened at all, was usually a full-body dunk in a river that made your teeth hurt. Cowboys didn't bathe daily, weekly, or sometimes even monthly. The only way you could tell who had cleaned themselves recently was by how shocked everyone else looked when they walked by. "You smell different," someone might whisper cautiously. "What did you do?" Toothbrushing was optional. Some cowboys chewed on pine twigs or rubbed baking soda on their teeth if they had it. Others just rinsed their mouth with coffee and hoped for the best. Dental hygiene wasn't really about prevention. It was about delay. You didn't try to keep your teeth forever. You just tried to keep them until the next paycheck. Still, there were boundaries. You didn't cough into the bean pot. You didn't double dip your biscuit into the lard bucket. And if you had open sores, you were expected to keep them from oozing on the coffee cups. Minimal standards, yes, but standards nonetheless. It was a strange, greasy brotherhood. Everyone was disgusting, everyone knew it, and no one cared. You could ride for weeks without a proper bath, sweat through every layer of clothing, and still sit around the fire at the end of the day with 20 other unwashed men, eating from the same pot and somehow feeling like you belonged. Because out here, there was no room for vanity. Clean hands didn't herd cattle, polished boots didn't chase rustlers, and soap, if you had it, was more useful for bartering than scrubbing. So you wipe your hands on your pants, scoop a dollop of beans onto your biscuit and chew with pride. You've earned it. Besides, the only real rule out here, don't die, and maybe don't lick the coffee ladle. Again. The fire crackles low, the sun hasn't yet cleared the ridge, and the cook is already elbow deep in dough that looks more like wall plaster than anything edible. You wander toward the smell, stomach hollowed out by sleep and salt pork, wondering if this is the morning you'll finally get something sweet. You shouldn't have. The chuckwagon had desserts, technically, just not the kind you'd want to write home about. Sugar was a luxury, butter was a dream, and milk? If it didn't come from a can or a goat you personally bribed, it wasn't happening. So cowboy desserts got creative, and by creative we mean horrifying. The lard pie was a favourite, and by favourite we mean it was made often, because there was always lard and never judgment. The crust was thick and chewy, made from flour, salt and enough pig fat to trigger nightmares. Inside, if you were lucky, maybe some dried apples. If you were less lucky, maybe just molasses and a handful of raisins that had clearly given up. The whole thing was baked in a scorched Dutch oven until the top blistered like sunburn. It sliced like shoe leather and chewed like a memory you'd rather forget. And then there was bean pudding. It sounds like a joke. It isn't. The cook would take leftover beans, and there were always leftover beans, mash them up with whatever sweetener he could find, maybe some grease for shine, and then bake the mess into something vaguely jiggly. If you were smart, you didn't ask what held it together. If you were dumb, you tasted it and wondered aloud what that afterbite was. The cook didn't answer. He just stared. Molasses figured into most dessert crimes. It was one of the few trail ingredients that could be found semi-regularly and didn't immediately rot in the sun. Poured over biscuits, molasses turned them from edible bricks into vaguely tolerable sugar bricks. Mixed into coffee, it became syrup sludge. Baked into cakes, and yes, they sometimes attempted cake, it became a kind of tar sponge that stuck to your teeth like betrayal. One cowboy reportedly used molasses to fix a hole in his saddlebag. The bag held. His trust in dessert did not. Now and then, someone would get ambitious. On one memorable night, the cook unveiled what he called a plum dumpling. It turned out to be a fist-sized wad of dough wrapped around a single dried prune, boiled in pork water, and served hot with a ladle of bean juice on top. One bite was enough to spark both digestive and spiritual reflection. The man who requested seconds was never seen again. Another crowd pleaser was dried fruit if you could find it. Apples, peaches or plums, rehydrated in a pot of water until they resembled fruit-shaped sadness. They were chewy, stringy, and more pit than pulp. Still, they offered a break from meat and beans, which made them worth gnawing through. You'd eat them in silence, staring into the fire, pretending they tasted like pie instead of boiled disappointment. And then there was sweet biscuit pudding, which sounds like a treat until you realise it was just stale biscuits crumbled into a pot with lard, molasses and desperation. It was cooked into a dense, sticky brick that could survive being dropped off a moving wagon. You ate it slowly, carefully, wondering if you were supposed to chew or just surrender. What passed for dessert out here wasn't about indulgence. It was about resourcefulness, about using what little you had left and trying to turn it into something that didn't taste like soot and loneliness. And if it stuck to your ribs on the way down, even better. You'd need the calories to shovel more beans tomorrow. Cowboys didn't expect sweet. They didn't expect soft or golden or fluffy. They expected food, loosely defined, that could be eaten fast and survive the journey from skillet to stomach. A good dessert didn't have to taste good. It just had to not make you cry. Still, the cook kept trying. He'd mash and stir and bake and boil, hoping to coax something sweet out of flour and fat. And once in a while, maybe once a month, once a drive, once a miracle, it would work. You'd bite into something warm, chewy, and vaguely comforting, and for one fleeting moment you'd remember home, your mother's pie, a birthday cake, a sweet roll from a bakery you passed years ago, and then it would pass. You'd belch, you'd swallow hard, and you'd get up, brush molasses from your moustache, and go saddle your horse. Because dessert on the trail wasn't for pleasure, it was for survival, and possibly dental sabotage. The wind picks up as you tighten your saddle, stomach still buzzing from breakfast. Or maybe it's just your organs begging for mercy. You're not sure. What you're sure of is that it's going to be a long ride and lunch is hours away. You check your saddlebags, feel around for anything that isn't covered in dust, and there it is. The hardened corner of a piece of jerky. Snack time. Cattle drives didn't come with snack breaks. There were no granola bars, no trail mix, no polite little packets of almonds. If you got hungry between meals, and you always got hungry between meals, You reached into your bag and pulled out something tough, dry, and vaguely edible. The key word being vaguely. Jerky was the classic cowboy snack. Tough, leathery strips of dried beef, salted within an inch of its life and cured in the open air until it resembled tree bark with a meat aftertaste. It was meant to last, not taste good, not chew easily. Just survive the journey and maybe give your jaw a workout along the way. Some batches were homemade, others were store-bought from dusty frontier trading posts, where the difference between meat and old saddle strap was mostly academic. The flavour? Smoke, salt, dust, and something you really didn't want to identify. If it bent, it was fresh. If it snapped, it had reached peak preservation. Some cowboys like to soak their jerky in coffee or water just to soften it up. Others just gnawed until it surrendered. You learned not to ask what part of the cow it came from, or if it was actually cow at all. Hard cheese was another cowboy snack staple, assuming you were lucky enough to get some. Not the soft, creamy kind. This was aged, cracked, and harder than most of your teeth. It came in wedges wrapped in cloth and tasted like barn and sadness. Still, it was protein, and it didn't need refrigeration, mostly because it had already aged into a form of edible granite. Pair it with jerky, and you had yourself a full set of digestive regrets. And then there were the pocket mysteries. Every cowboy had them, those odd lumps wrapped in cloth or wax paper, shoved deep into coat pockets, forgotten for days or weeks until rediscovered during a slow moment on the trail. Could be a leftover biscuit, could be a chunk of dried fruit, could be a chunk of something that used to be food and now lived in a state of moral ambiguity. You'd unwrap it slowly, give it a sniff, maybe poke it once. If it didn't move, bite in. If it crumbled into dust or squeaked, reconsider. But if it held together and didn't taste like boot leather, congratulations, that's lunch. Sometimes you might get dried apples or peaches, sticky, stringy, and more pit than pulp, but they were sweet, sort of. You had to chew for a while, but once you got past the texture of rope, you were rewarded with a vague whisper of fruit. If the cook had extra, he might trade some for tobacco, soap, or the rare luxury of not being insulted before dinner. Crackers showed up now and then. Civil War-style hardtack, flour and water baked until all joy had fled, occasionally made its way onto the trail. If you found one in your bag, you'd have to soak it in coffee, stew, or your own spit before it was chewable. Otherwise, it just shattered into floury debris and lodged itself in your esophagus like edible drywall. And on desperate days, you turned to sugar cubes. Yes, sugar cubes. Originally meant for horses, but cowboys with a sweet tooth and no shame would pop one into their mouth and suck on it slowly, like a sad, gritty candy. It wasn't glamorous, but it beat chewing leather. There was also something known only as trail fudge. Don't let the name fool you. It had no chocolate, no cream, no mercy. Just lard, flour, a splash of molasses if the gods were kind, and a handful of peanuts or crushed beans if they weren't. Pressed into a square, wrapped in paper, and left to congeal in your pocket for a week. It kept you alive. It also haunted your dreams. Cowboy snacks weren't about pleasure. They were about tactical digestion. Something to keep the stomach from eating itself during long stretches between meals. They didn't need to taste good. They just needed to stay intact after being smashed, sat on, dropped, or used to level out a wobbly wagon wheel. You'd chew slowly, savouring the quiet, the wind, the buzz of distant cattle. Dust in your mouth, salt on your lips, your jaw moving like an old barn hinge. That was a cowboy snack. That was the good stuff. And if it didn't make you gag or hallucinate, you'd call it a success. Because on the trail, anything you could eat without boiling, frying, or apologising to your stomach later. That was a delicacy. You don't admit it out loud. Not to the cook, not to the trail boss, not even to the guy riding next to you whose coffee breath could bend iron. But deep down, in the quieter, more unholy part of your soul, You know it's true. You've been drinking, not just water, not just coffee. You've been dipping into something stronger, something medicinal, something that may or may not have been stored in a boot for the last 40 miles. And the best part? No one cares. Because out here, spiking your breakfast wasn't just tolerated, it was practically tradition. Alcohol was the cowboy's secret ingredient. Not for the cooking, for the living. Mornings on the cattle trail were cold, dusty, exhausting, and usually flavoured with yesterday's beans. A man needed help facing that kind of reality. A splash of whiskey in your coffee, a nip of corn liquor before breakfast, a sip of tonic from a tin flask tucked under your coat. That was how you shook the frost off your bones and pretended your biscuit didn't just bounce. Of course, no one called it drinking. That was something saloon drunks and outlaws did. You were just taking your medicine, and that medicine came with all kinds of names. Snakebite cure, toothache tonic, cough syrup, trail balm, liquid bravery, or, most accurately, breakfast booster. It came in jugs, flasks, jars, or unlabelled bottles with mysterious sediment floating in the bottom. If it burned your throat and made your boots feel like they weren't touching the ground, it was the good stuff. If it made you go blind in one eye for 20 minutes, it was too good. You didn't ask where it came from. A travelling peddler, a friendly settler, the cook's personal stash. As long as it was liquid and flammable, it worked. There were cowboys who swore by specific rituals. 1 swig before coffee, 2 swigs if the coffee was bad, a third if the beans had that sour tang that suggested they'd been reheated one too many times. Some stirred their hooch directly into the mug, giving that black sludge of cowboy coffee a sharp, sour edge that made your eyes water and your tongue rethink its job. Others took it neat, right out of the flask, before breakfast, during breakfast, occasionally in place of breakfast. There was no hard rule about when to drink, only when not to get caught. You didn't show up sloppy, you didn't ride sideways in the saddle unless you'd been bucked, and you sure as hell didn't spill a drop. Out here, liquor was as precious as bullets. You rationed it, bartered it, protected it. A single swig could buy you a biscuit, a favour, or a turn standing downwind during the bean hour. The cook knew, of course he knew, he pretended not to. Until you crossed the line, slurred your thanks, sang to the coffee pot, tried to toast the salt pork with your flask. Then you got the look, and if you got the look twice, the cook might accidentally forget your plate the next morning. Trail justice was subtle and greasy. Still, some took it too far. There were stories. Cowboys who tried to ride drunk and ended up lassoing their own horse. A man who poured whiskey into the lard pot by mistake and created a breakfast so volatile it exploded near the fire. Another who insisted his molasses was fermented and drank half a tin before collapsing face first into the beans. No one moved him. They just ate around him. But for most, the morning drink was quiet. Just a small moment. You sat by the fire, cold in your boots, watching the steam rise from your plate and the smoke twist from the pan. You reached into your coat, pulled the flask, tilted it back, let it burn all the way down to your stomach where it mixed with beans, coffee, and the whispered hope that today wouldn't be the day you fell off your horse and got trampled by your own cow. The alcohol didn't make the food taste better, nothing could, but it did make the morning a little warmer, the coffee a little less tragic, the salt pork a little less gelatinous. And when the sun finally crested the horizon and the cattle started moving, your legs still worked, your hat still fit, and your stomach was quiet, for now. Because out here the line between breakfast and survival was thin, and sometimes it came in a flask. You were in the saddle before your coffees even had a chance to cool, which is unfortunate because now it's sloshing in your gut like a pot of hot regret. The cattle are already moving, the wind's picked up, and breakfast, it's still churning around inside you like it's planning an escape. Welcome to one of the most beloved cowboy traditions of all, skipping breakfast and pretending you're fine. See, not every morning allowed for a hot plate of beans and biscuits. Sometimes, you were already halfway into the day's ride before the cook even got the fire going. Other times, a storm was rolling in, or the herd spooked early, or the trail boss decided to make up time and shouted, "Mount up," before your biscuit even finished burning your tongue. And so, you rode hungry. Or worse, you rode with half a breakfast inside you. Cold beans bouncing in your gut, a biscuit lodged somewhere behind your ribs, and that signature lump of salt pork rattling around like a bad decision with its own opinions. The chuckwagon might meet up with the herd later in the day, but until then, it was just you, your horse, your stomach, and the gnawing memory of what you should have eaten. Riding on an empty stomach wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Cowboys burned thousands of calories a day, roping, herding, wrangling strays, chasing down wayward calves, hauling gear, dodging rattlesnakes, and occasionally sprinting from lightning storms with their boots untied. Without food, your energy faded fast. Hands shook, legs went numb, and your brain. It started inventing smells, delicious smells, like fresh bread, roasted meat, a peach pie that absolutely didn't exist. Sometimes hunger made cowboys desperate. A man might reach into his saddlebag and gnaw on leftover jerky if he had any. If he didn't, he might try his luck with a bit of hardtack that had survived a month at the bottom of his gear. One unfortunate cowboy famously tried to eat a lump of dried tobacco in a moment of confused hunger. He was found 20 minutes later, lying face down in the dust, swearing he'd spoken with the ghost of his mule. The worst part was watching the cook roll past around midday with the wagon, casually chewing something as he bounced along the trail. You'd shout down for food, he'd shrug. "Next stop," he'd yell, as if your stomach was a time traveller with patience. The only thing that kept you going was spite, and the faint promise of lunch, assuming lunch didn't get trampled or catch fire first. Some cowboys tried to plan ahead. They'd pocket part of their breakfast, a half biscuit, a chunk of dried fruit, a wedge of salt pork too gristly to chew on the first try. This emergency snack was called rider's insurance, and it lived wrapped in a bandana or stuffed in the cuff of a boot. Of course, it didn't always survive. One bump, one bad fall, and your snack was either crushed or donated to the prairie. The truth was, skipping breakfast happened a lot more than anyone liked to admit. Weather, cattle, broken gear. It didn't matter how hungry you were if the herd was moving. And out here, food didn't wait for you. You waited for food, sometimes all day, sometimes until you were so hollow you could hear the echoes inside your ribcage. And yet, cowboys adapted. You learned to ride with the hunger, to focus on the rhythm of your horse, to keep your eyes on the trail and your hands busy, so you didn't think too hard about the fire-cooked mess you missed that morning. You told yourself it was fine, that breakfast was overrated, that hunger made you sharp, and then you'd smell someone else's biscuit, the one cowboy who did eat before the ride. The scent would hit you like a punch to the soul. You'd look over, he'd take a slow bite, chew, smile, and in that moment he was the most powerful man in the world. You'd consider violence, but your stomach was too busy digesting the memory of coffee grounds to give you the energy, so you kept riding. Because that's what cowboys did. They moved forward, hungry, tired, sometimes dreaming of toast, and when the chuckwagon finally stopped and the cook rang the bell, you didn't care what was on the plate. It could be scorched, it could be cold, it could be beans. Again, you'd eat it with your hands, because breakfast might not come on time, but when it did, it never, ever lasted long. You're sitting by the fire after a long day of riding, your belt loosened, your boots kicked off, and your gut making noises that suggest either digestion or imminent betrayal. You glance around at the other cowboys, all of them quietly stewing in their own discomfort, shifting on logs, pulling at their suspenders, and coughing awkwardly into the smoke. No one says anything, but everyone knows what's coming. The beanstorm. Because out here on the trail, after a week straight of grease-fried biscuits, salted pig fat and beans, served at every meal like a biblical curse, the air becomes charged. Not just unpleasant, tactical. This is where the unspoken rules of cowboy camp come into play. A sacred code not written in any manual, but forged in the fires of digestive desperation, post-breakfast gas diplomacy. Every cowboy knew the risks. Beans, eaten in volume and cooked questionably over open flame, had a tendency to fight back. They didn't digest. They fermented. They plotted. By late afternoon, your insides were an orchestra of bubbling complaints, and if you didn't get some space from the fire and your fellow man, things got dangerous. At first, it was manageable. A polite lean to one side, a shuffle downwind, a sharp glance before repositioning your bedroll. But the longer you were on the trail, the more formal the system became. Men learned to identify safe zones. Behind the wagon wheel, past the water barrel, 20 feet downwind of the main group and uphill if possible. Distance was key, but so was timing. There was the slow release during saddle check strategy, a subtle maneuver performed while tightening your cinch, where you'd let it rip under cover of leather creak and horse snort. Then there was the get up to stretch technique, where a man would stand, casually walk 10 paces, and blast the prairie with everything his breakfast had to offer. But the most sacred and most feared was the night release. After dinner, under the stars, bedrolls laid out in a neat ring around the fire, you swaddled in your blanket pretending to be asleep. Then, from the darkness, a sound. Not a twig, not a coyote, something wetter, more personal, a declaration, a warning shot. The others pretend not to notice. No one dares laugh, because if you mock it, you'll be next. The night release is contagious. One man lets loose, and suddenly the whole camp is echoing with digestive discontent. Sleep becomes a game of survival, not from wolves or rustlers, but from the noxious clouds wafting from the roll beside you. This is why cowboys slept apart whenever they could. You didn't cuddle, you didn't spoon, you didn't even nap in a friendly way unless you were downwind and deeply desperate. Your sleeping spot was chosen for airflow and bean proximity. Some men tied scarves over their faces, others slept with heads under their saddles, not for comfort, but as a makeshift gas shield. The cook, of course, claimed innocence. "Ain't the beans," he'd mutter, stoking the fire. "It's your weak constitution." But he knew. Everyone knew. His secret seasoning was just recycled lard. His idea of spice was not washing the pot. He once made chili with 8-day-old pork and said it was extra tender. It wasn't. It was alive. Cowboys developed strategies to reduce the damage. A sip of vinegar in the morning, a plug of tobacco before bed. One man swore by sitting directly on a cold rock after breakfast, claiming it sealed the valves. Another carried a tiny wooden spoon and stirred his beans clockwise before eating, said it kept the bubbles out. It didn't. It just made his beans cold. But there was also a strange camaraderie in it all, a group understanding, a mutual agreement that everyone was disgusting equally and fully. If you broke wind during a story, you didn't pause. If a horse sneezed and you let one slip, you blamed the horse. If someone coughed and their bedroll deflated, no one made eye contact. You just kept eating. Because out here, digestion wasn't private. It was part of the trail, the cost of doing business, the consequence of living off beans, biscuits, bacon, and whatever else the cook could boil into submission. So you roll over in your bedroll, the stars are out, the air is still, and just as you're about to drift off, there it is, low, vibrating, slightly questioning. You don't say a word, you just shift your roll 10 feet to the left and pray for wind. It's the middle of winter on the trail. Your breath fogs in front of your face. Your fingers are stiff. Your biscuit is frozen solid, and has developed what you can only describe as a frost shell. The fire crackles weakly under a damp log, and the cook, shivering behind the wagon, is elbow deep in a vat of congealed fat that smells like last week's pork accident. Spirits are low. Morale is cracking like the surface of your salt pork, and just when you think the morning couldn't get more cursed, the seal fat feast begins. No one remembers exactly when this tradition started. Some say it was the result of a supply mix-up. The wrong barrel, marked animal oil, delivered from a far-off trading post and misidentified by a half-blind trail hand. Others claim it was intentional, the cook's idea of something different after a month of beans. Whatever the origin, it became a cold-weather legend. The day the chuckwagon rolled out a full meal powered almost entirely by blubber. Seal fat wasn't standard cowboy fare. It wasn't even frontier fare. It was coastal, northern, borrowed from indigenous foodways, traded down by trappers, and somehow, mysteriously, ended up in the hands of men who had no business touching it. The result? A culinary experiment that began with hope and ended with confusion, regret, and an unholy number of grease fires. The cook called it winter stew, though stew is a generous term. It started with a massive chunk of hard, pale fat, slick, gelatinous, and deeply suspicious, hacked into cubes with a knife that kept slipping. The pieces were tossed into the skillet with a hiss and a pop that suggested something alive had just screamed. Smoke poured up immediately, thick and foul. The fire flared. A spoon melted. The cook didn't flinch. He added beans. Of course, because nothing calms an exploding fat bomb like a fresh scoop of legumes. Then came the biscuits, crumbled in, soggy and weeping. The whole mess bubbled like lava, occasionally burping out a glob of grey foam that no one volunteered to identify. The smell was unforgettable. Imagine bacon grease left in the sun for a week, then hit with a hammer and made sad. And yet, you ate it. You all did. Because the cold was brutal. You needed calories. And because the cook stood behind the pot with a ladle in one hand and an axe in the other. The stew was served in dented bowls that immediately became slippery with oil. The seal fat floated to the top like shimmering ghosts. You didn't chew, you didn't look, you just shoveled. The taste? Somewhere between candle wax and regret. It coated your mouth, your teeth, your throat. You could feel it sliding into your stomach like a warm sock full of lard. It burned going down. It burned after going down, and worst of all, it didn't go anywhere. That fat stuck with you for hours, days, possibly years. But here's the thing, it worked. For the first time in weeks you were full, truly full, not, I ate a fistful of biscuit crumbs and called it good, full, but heavy, warm, and vaguely insulated from the cold. The fat lit a fire inside you, a slow burn that helped fight off the morning chill. Your fingers thawed. Your joints stopped aching. You stopped thinking about dying every time a snowflake hit your face. Of course, there were consequences. The post-meal digestion was brutal. You felt every ounce of fat crawl through your system like it was mapping the trail. Men wandered off into the trees one by one, slow and bent like haunted cryptids. The camp went silent for hours. One man reportedly sat still for so long he was mistaken for a stump. He didn't move until dinner. Seal fat feast didn't happen often. The cook claimed the barrel was gone after the first serving, but no one believed him. Rumours swirled that he hid the rest behind the wagon, doling it out secretly when he thought spirits were too high. "Can't have you boys getting soft," he muttered once, holding a biscuit that dripped like a candle. The next time it showed up, no one said a word. You just nodded grimly, took your bowl and stared into it like it held a prophecy. You ate slower. You braced for the burn. But a strange thing happened. You weren't as cold anymore. and as you climb back into the saddle, fat still clinging to your teeth like a greasy promise, you realise something most cowboys never admitted. You kind of respected it. Not the taste, never the taste, but the power, the warmth, the pure, unholy energy it gave you to ride through sleet, wind, and another cursed day of cattle and coffee sludge. Because out here, in the icy clutches of trail life, food wasn't about flavour. It was about survival and seal fat. That was survival served hot and greasy, with a side of existential dread. Cowboy cuisine was shaped less by taste and more by necessity, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the act of cooking itself. With no ovens, no kitchens, and certainly no refrigeration, cowboys cooked everything over an open campfire. The method was simple: build a fire, balance a skillet or Dutch oven over it, and hope the wind didn't ruin your one shot at a hot meal. Chuckwagon cooks had to be versatile, patient, and occasionally reckless. Their kitchens consisted of a few key tools: a heavy iron skillet, a soot-blackened coffee pot, a Dutch oven with a lipped lid for burying in coals, and, if they were lucky, a wire grill or spit. But for the most part, cowboy meals were prepared with one hand on the spoon and the other swatting flies or shielding the fire from dust storms. Temperature control was laughable. Fire intensity depended on wind, fuel, and luck. There was no low simmer, just roaring flame or stubborn embers. Food was either undercooked or burned. Anything mildly warm and edible was considered a culinary victory. Dutch ovens were particularly prized. These heavy lidded pots could be buried in hot coals to simulate baking. Biscuits, stews, beans, and even pies were cooked this way. The results varied wildly. A common technique was to pile coals underneath and more on top of the lid, rotating the pot occasionally to prevent one side from catching fire. This method was both an art and a gamble. Stews and beans were constant fixtures. The longer they simmered, the better they got, mostly because it gave the tougher ingredients time to surrender. Beans required several hours of low heat, which meant they were often started the night before and left simmering until breakfast. The result was usually scorched at the bottom, watery at the top, and somewhere in the middle, possibly edible. Meat was fried almost exclusively. Salt pork, bacon, and sometimes beef were sliced, seared in their own fat, and often doubled as a lubricant for whatever was cooking next. Flavours bled together. Breakfast might taste like last night's stew. Biscuits came with notes of charred meat. Even the coffee pot had flavour memory from years of use without proper cleaning. Speaking of coffee, cowboy coffee was boiled directly over the fire, often for hours, with grounds thrown straight into the pot. Crushed eggshells were sometimes added to help the grounds settle. A good pot of coffee was thick, black, and vaguely metallic. You didn't sip it so much as endure it. There were no thermometers, no measuring spoons, and certainly no timers. Recipes were passed down by word of mouth, and measurements were typically expressed as a handful, a splash, or until it smells right. Cooks worked by instinct and repetition, adjusting for wind, weather, and trail conditions. Cleanliness was relative. Pans were wiped between uses, usually with an oily rag or leftover biscuit. Soap was rarely used, and water was too valuable for scrubbing. As a result, most cookware developed a protective layer of char, grease, and potential bacteria that, in cowboy terms, counted as seasoning. The realities of fire cooking also meant high risk of accidents. Burns were common, fires went out in the rain. In dry conditions, fires spread quickly. One bad spark could ignite the entire cook area. Stories of chuckwagon explosions caused by unattended grease are scattered throughout frontier lore, most of them ending with someone being launched several feet and still holding their biscuit. Despite all of this, campfire cooking wasn't just about feeding men, it was about keeping them alive. The meals may have been greasy, repetitive, and borderline dangerous, but they were hot, heavy, and calorie-dense. After 10 hours of riding herd, even blackened beans and lard-fried biscuits could feel like comfort food. In the end, campfire cooking was survival disguised as cuisine. It was functional, filthy, and built for movement. Cowboys didn't expect variety, texture, or taste. They expected heat, calories, and just enough flavour to make them forget they were eating beans again. And for that, the fire was enough, most days. Cowboy breakfasts weren't meant to be balanced, or safe, or frankly, palatable. They were built for fuel, function, and pure survival. Everything was cooked over open flame, eaten off a dented tin plate, and digested at your own risk. There were no food groups. There was only what you could carry, fry, and not die from. But somehow, it worked. The cowboys endured, not because their food was good, but because it was hot, heavy, and got them through 20-mile rides and sub-zero nights. That biscuit. It may have cracked your tooth, but it kept you moving. That coffee. It may have tasted like despair, but it kept you awake. And those beans, well, the beans were the price of admission. Thanks for riding along on this greasy, gut-busting journey through the American frontier's most dangerous meal. If you're still awake, give that like button a tip of the hat. Or maybe subscribe for more sleep time history that's heavy on facts and light on seasoning. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and be grateful for the miracle of modern breakfast. Because tonight, you're not full of beans. Not anymore.